In my last video, I showed how to set up a basic email server on Ubuntu server using Postfix and Dovecot as the SNTP and IMAP servers, respectively. In this video, I will show you how to configure the server to validate incoming emails, which I'll explain further when we actually get into it, as well as how to install and configure SpamAssassin for our spam filter. Okay, so first you're going to log into your mail server, and then we're going to configure it to verify SPF records, which essentially verifies that the IP address sending mail is authorized to send mail on behalf of a domain. To do that, first do sudo apt install postfix -policy d-spf -python. Then hit enter. Hit yes to install these packages. Okay, and now let's configure it. So next do sudo nano /etc/postfix /master.cf, and then scroll down to the end of the file, and then paste in these two lines, which I'll have in the description. And this will basically tell Postfix to use the SPF policy agent that we've installed to verify SPF records. Now hit Ctrl+X, then Y, then hit Enter to save and close the file. Now do sudo nano /etc/postfix /main.cf, and then scroll all the way to the bottom of the file, and then copy and paste in these lines from the description. And these are also required for Postfix to talk to the SPF verifier agent. Then hit Ctrl+X, then hit Y, then hit Enter to save, and then do sudo systemctl restart postfix for changes to take effect, and now it'll verify SPF records. Note that this does not create SPF records in our DNS. That's handled by our mail relay, which I've set up in my last video. But now we're going to set up this server to verify DKIM records. To do that, do sudo apt install open DKIM -tools. Then hit yes to install these packages. And then we've got to add the Postfix user to the open DKIM group by doing sudo add user postfix open DKIM. And by the way, all these commands will be in the description. And now we've got to make a directory for open DKIM with sudo mkdir /var /spool /postfix /open DKIM. And then we got to change the ownership of that directory to the open DKIM user and the postfix group by doing sudo chown open DKIM :postfix /var /spool /postfix /open DKIM. And yes, these users and groups are intentionally flipped around. Okay, now we can get to actually configuring open DKIM by doing sudo nano /etc/open DKIM.conf, and then uncomment the log y line, and then change that to yes, and then come down to where it says socket, comment out this first line, and then uncomment this last socket line where it says local :/var /spool /postfix /open DKIM /open DKIM.sock, because that actually represents the directory that we just created before opening this file. And then come down to the end of the file and then paste in these lines from the description, and then hit Ctrl+X, then Y, then Enter to save and close the file. Now do sudo nano slash etc slash default slash open DKIM, and then come down to the socket line, put everything after the equals sign in double quotes, then delete rundir slash open DKIM.sock, and then replace this with slash var slash spool slash postfix slash open DKIM slash open DKIM dot sock. And by the way, the reason why we're changing open DKIM's socket directory is so that postfix can actually access it, which is required for the services to communicate properly. Then hit Control X, then hit Y, then hit Enter. And now the next thing we're going to do is create a trusted hosts file, because we don't need to verify mail coming from our own server. To do that, first we've got to do sudo mkdir slash etc slash open DKIM, and then sudo nano slash etc slash open DKIM slash trusted dot hosts, which is the file that we've defined in our opendkim.conf file. And then first of all, you're going to add localhost, which should be within your server, and then add dot and then your domain name. Again, in this series of videos, I'm just pretending that demo.drewreddentech.com is my root domain. And yes, I've intentionally put a dot before my domain name. That is actually important. Do not put a star before that. Otherwise, this will only work on subdomains, but not your root domain. And you probably want this working on your root domain as well. But anyway, once you're done, it should look something like this, except yours should only have one dot. But then hit Control X, then hit Y, then hit Enter. But now we need to configure postfix to talk to OpenDKIM by doing sudo nano slash etc slash postfix slash main.cf, and then come down to the end of the file and then paste in these lines from the description, then hit Control X, then Y, then Enter to save. And then finally, you're going to restart the OpenDKIM and postfix services for our changes to take effect with sudo systemctl restart postfix OpenDKIM. And now the next step is to set up DMARC verification on our server. So first of all, we got to install the OpenDMARC service with sudo apt install OpenDMARC. Then hit yes to install these packages. Now, when it asks for if you want to configure a database for OpenDMARC, this isn't really necessary for small email servers like ours, so I choose no here. So now the next step is to add the postfix user to the OpenDMARC group with sudo add user postfix OpenDMARC. And then we're going to create a directory for OpenDMARC with sudo mkdir slash var slash spool slash postfix slash OpenDMARC. And then we've got to change the ownership of that directory to the OpenDMARC user and group with sudo chown OpenDMARC OpenDMARC slash var slash spool slash postfix slash OpenDMARC. And then we've got to change the permissions so that our OpenDMARC user can read and write it, and the OpenDMARC group can read it, and others have no access. To do that, do sudo chmod 750 slash var slash spool slash postfix slash OpenDMARC. Oh, it actually helps if you spell DMARC correctly. Okay, and now we can actually configure OpenDMARC with sudo nano slash etc slash OpenDMARC.conf. Now come down to auth server ID, uncomment that, and then replace name with open DMARC, exactly like that, and then come down to socket and replace local /run/open DMARC/open DMARC.sock with local /var/spool/postfix/open DMARC/open DMARC.sock. And again, this is necessary so that postfix and open DMARC can talk to each other. Then come down to trusted auth server IDs, uncomment that line, and then replace it with your mail server's fully qualified domain name, www.demo.dreadtech.com in my case. Now come up to reject failures, uncomment that line, and then change this to true, which will cause your mail server to reject an incoming email if DMARC validation fails, and the DMARC policy of the domain in the from field is set to reject, which is the case with domains of many major companies. This will cut down on phishing emails that you may receive. Now come down to the end of the file, and then you're going to add in a few lines, which again are in the description. So first of all, ignore authenticated clients, true, because we don't need to validate anything coming from our own domain. And then required headers, true, and then SPF self-validate, true, so that open DMARC performs SPF validation in case the SPF validation service were to fail for some reason. And now hit Control X, then Y, then Enter to save and close that file. And now come back into the postfix/main.cf file with sudo nano/etc/postfix/main.cf, and then come down to our milter configuration that we've added when setting up open DKIM. And then on the SMTPD milters line, at the end of that, after open DKIM.sock, add comma, local, open DMARC/open DMARC.sock. And then hit Control X, then Y, then Enter to save and close the file. And now for our changes to take effect, we've got to restart postfix and open DMARC with sudo systemctl restart postfix open DMARC. All right, DMARC validation is now set up. Now note, open DKIM is not set up to sign outgoing emails. That's handled by our relay. This setup only verifies incoming emails. Same with open DMARC. This does not validate outgoing emails. With DMARC, only incoming emails. Outgoing email validation is handled, again, by our mail relay. Okay, so now that we've got email verification out of the way, now we get to the meat of the video, and that is installing a spam filter. Now, some people will create rules in their postfix configuration. Well, you can do that. That method is very limited as to what it can do, and you might not want to reject a message or put it into the spam folder based on a single rule. In my opinion, you need something that's more intelligent, and that's where a package called SpamAssassin comes in. We can install it with sudo apt install SpamAssassin spamass-milter spamc. Then hit enter and hit yes to install all these packages. All right, now once that finally installs, that will actually take a little bit. Now we have to configure postfix to pass incoming emails to SpamAssassin with sudo nano /etc/postfix/main.cf. And now go to the bottom of that file where we have our milter configuration. Go to the end of the smtpd Miller's line. Then after open DMARC.sock, put comma, local, :spamass, :spamass.sock. Then hit Control X, Y, and then enter to save and close the file. Now restart postfix with sudo systemctl restart postfix to apply the changes to our postfix configuration file. Now postfix is using SpamAssassin to filter incoming emails. Now in case you're unfamiliar, SpamAssassin comes with a wide range of predefined rules to check the spamminess of emails, and it operates based on a score system. So when an email gets to a predefined score, by default 5.0, the email is marked as spam. So now there are some defaults that I like to change. The first essential one is going to sudo nano /etc/default/spamass-milter, then come down to the end of this file and then paste in this line from the description. This modifies the maximum message size that can go through SpamAssassin, and if a message exceeds that size, SpamAssassin simply won't filter it at all. By default, this is set to 512 kilobytes, which is way too low. Ideally, this should be set to the same as your message max size setting in your postfix configuration file, which I touched on in my last video where I set up this email server, and I set that to 25 megabytes, which is 26,214,400 bytes. That's what I'd recommend for an email server, since that's the convention. If you haven't configured a message max size parameter in your postfix configuration file, then it's 10 megabytes by default. But anyway, once you've added that in, hit Control X, then Y, then enter to save the file. So now, if you look into the /usr/share/SpamAssassin directory, there are a ton of rules in here. I cannot possibly go over all of them in this video, so feel free to look at all those on your own time. But for now, I'm going to go into the sudo nano /usr/share/spamassassin/local.cf file. And this is where you make any configuration changes. Now come down all the way to the bottom of this file, and now I'm going to show you how to change scores for existing rules. For example, I like to change the missing from rule by doing score space missing underscore from. That's what that rule is called. And basically, the missing from rule checks if an email message is missing a from field in the header, which is required for all email messages to have. So I like to give this a 5.0 score to send that straight to the spam folder. Same with missing date to check for a missing date field in the header. Also required for every email message. So set that to a 5.0 score. And now I'm going to change a third rule, and that is missing underscore headers that checks for a missing to field in an email address, which this may come as a shock, but it's actually technically speaking not required for an email message. So I'm not going to give it a 5.0 score. However, I like to give it a very high score, like 3.5, because I have never seen a legitimate email destined for a different domain missing this header field. Another rule I like to modify is empty message, and that checks if the message body is empty. I like to give that a 5.0 score. Just send that straight to the spam folder, because why read it if it's empty? Now I'm going to modify another rule, and that is DKIM underscore ADSP underscore NX domain, and that essentially checks if the domain in the from field doesn't exist, because some spammers will use a non-existent domain in the from field. So I like to send those straight to the spam folder. The last existing rule that I'm going to modify is from domain no vowel, and that checks if the domain in the from field contains no vowels. Now, I like to give this a very high score, since it is exceptionally rare to find a legitimate email domain with no vowels, especially considering that all the commonly used top-level domains like .com, .org, .net already contain vowels. So the vast majority of domains that don't contain any vowels are spammy. Okay, so now I'm going to show you an example of custom rules that I've pre-written for my own email server. And by the way, you can actually even just paste in all these from the description. So now there's a couple additional line types that I'm going to introduce you to, and those are header and describe. So first of all, I'm going to start with the header checks. So header is, unsurprisingly, what performs a header check. Then you're going to name that rule, and then after that, you put in the check to do. So first of all, this rule checks if the email address in the from field is the same as the email address in the to field, which is very suspicious. And then what describe does is this allows you to provide a description for what the rule does. And then again, score is what you actually use to score a particular rule. So I like to give this type of email a 2.0 score. My header empty return path checks if the return path is empty, which all emails should have a return path header, even though it's technically not required. Like, this is where email servers will send bounce messages if an email cannot be delivered. So if an email is missing that, I like to give it a high score. And then if DMARC failed, I think the score for that is kind of low by default, so I like to give it a high score. And now for subject spam, I also check the subject line to see if it contains my email address, which is something a lot of spammers do, because it's very easy to do that automatically rather than putting in your name. So I like to give that a very high score. I'm sure there are a couple legitimate email senders that are out there doing that, but they're definitely in an overwhelming minority. Now we come to the body checks. The only body check I have as of right now is I've named it Be Polite, which means use my actual name, not my email address when you're addressing me. This rule checks if my email address appears after the words hi, hello, or dear. This is a tactic that a lot of spammers do. Again, automation. So I like to send that straight to the spam folder. Use my real name, please. Okay, so now we come down to what's called a meta rule. What you do is you create a rule to check if something exists, doing meta and then a new rule name, and then putting an exclamation mark, and then the rule that you just defined above to check if something does not exist in an email, either in the header or in the body. So for example, this rule checks to see if an @ does not exist in the from field, which all emails should have an @ symbol in the from field. So I give this a very high score, or not 5.0, as it's technically speaking not required by email standards, but I've never seen a legitimate email missing that. And then this next rule checks to see if there's a dot in the from field, which all internet domains should universally have a dot, since ICANN, or Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the governing body of domain names, has a rule that no single word domains are allowed. All domains have to, at the very least, consist of domain name and then a top level domain, which is separated by a dot. So simply put, all emails should universally have a dot in the from field. So again, even though it's technically not required by RFCs, I like to give that a very high score. Yeah, really the one exception I can think of is localhost, which refers to like this server, which you may have an application that sends emails from at localhost, which we're going to whitelist that after I finish explaining all this. Now I've also defined a rule to postmaster that checks if an email has been sent to the postmaster address instead of your actual contact email address. Like, as I've said in my last video, the postmaster address is required for all email servers. So we all know that your server and my server has a postmaster address, and so do spammers. So I don't like to give this too high of a score because, again, it is a required email account or alias to have, and there are legitimate uses for it because someone may want to get in touch with your mail server administrator and they don't know how your organization is structured. Like, for example, they might need to report abuse if your email system is compromised or something. However, because everyone knows that we have a postmaster address, emails sent to postmaster are more likely to be spam. So I like to give those an extra point. And then finally, I've done a check for the list unsubscribe in the header. If an email header contains that, then it means that your email address has been added to a mailing list. So I like to give that a 2.5 score because you might not want emails from a mailing list. Now keep in mind that some important emails, like in particular from online services that send automated alerts, emails, for example, account login alerts, will have this field, so I don't send those straight to the spam folder necessarily. And also keep in mind that if you're using Brevo as your SMTP relay, then it will add the list unsubscribe header to all your outgoing emails. Unfortunately, there's no way to get rid of that. If there is, I couldn't find it. And now the reason why I don't just look for the word unsubscribe in emails is because spammers won't always add it to their emails. And even when they do, they might even misspell it on purpose to get around spam filters. So checking for the word unsubscribe in the body isn't effective. Okay, so after explaining all that, if you're still with me, there's a couple other lines we're going to add, and that is to whitelist emails coming from our domain. To do that, do whitelist _from, and then star at localhost. This is actually the first one I like to have, for emails coming from within your server that are generated by applications on your server. And then whitelist from star at your domain to whitelist all emails coming from your domain. Now, any emails coming from these domains will still go through the spam filter. However, what these rules do is start these emails out with a score of -100, so that it's not even possible for them to hit a 5.0 score. And of course, you can also whitelist other domains or even individual email addresses here. And then once you're done, you just hit Control-X, then Y, then hit Enter to save and close the file. So of course, there's a lot more you can do to fine-tune SpamAssassin to your liking. I've just scratched the surface. One more configuration option that I actually forgot to mention is if you go back into your SpamAss milter configuration file with sudo nano /etc/default /spamass-milter. If you come down to this line underneath reject emails with SpamAssassin scores greater than 15, if you uncomment this line, then SpamAssassin will cause Postfix to outright reject emails that reach a certain SpamAssassin score, by default 15, but you can change this to whatever number you like so that they're not even delivered at all, not even put in your spam folder. However, I don't like to enable this because I want emails marked as spam to at least be put in my spam folder, just in case I have a false positive. But again, you just hit Control X, then Y, then Enter to save and close the file. The option to save didn't show for me there because I didn't actually make any changes. Okay, and then once we're done with that, now you've got to restart SpamAssassin to apply our changes with sudo systemctl restart spamass-milter spamd. And yes, I intentionally put spamd here instead of spamc because spamd is what the service is actually called. Now, once that's done, there's one more package we have to install and configure in order to have Dovecot move messages marked as spam to the junk folder. So now do sudo apt install dovecot-civ, spelled like that. And now do sudo nano /etc/conf.d/15-lda.conf. Then come down to mail plugins, which will be all the way at the bottom of the file. Then uncomment that line. Then add civ at the end of it to have Dovecot load the Dovecot civ plugin that we just installed. Then hit Control X, then Y, then Enter to save and close the file. And now you've got to do sudo nano /etc/dovecot/conf.d/20-lmtp.conf. And you've also got to make that same change in this file. Again, come down to the end of the file where you see the mail plugins line, uncomment that line, and then add civ at the end of it, then hit Control X, then Y, then Enter to save the file. And now we've got to write a little civ script that will find the spam flag that SpamAssassin puts in the header of spam messages, and then move that file into the junk folder if found. To do that, do sudo nano /var/mail/spam-to-junk.civ. Just copy and paste in these lines of code that I'll have in the description, then hit Control X, then Y, then Enter to save the file. And now for better efficiency, we're going to compile this script with sudo civc /var/mail/spam-to-junk.civ. And now we've got to add that script that we just made to our Dovecot configuration with sudo nano /etc/devcot/90-civ.conf, and then come down to the civ before line, uncomment that, and then delete everything that is in civ before, and then replace it with /var/mail/spam-to-junk.civ to point to that civ script that we just made. Then hit Control X, then Y, then hit Enter to save and close the file. And now we got to apply our configuration changes by restarting Dovecot with sudo systemctl restart Dovecot. In order to test that this is working, send yourself a test email to your server and then inspect the header of the email when it arrives at your server. And then you should see these headers, like what's shown on screen. Now, after setting this up, you will notice that incoming emails will take significantly longer to reach your inbox, especially on servers with limited resources like what I'm using. But that's it for this video. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, comment, share with your friends, all that good stuff, and stay tuned for my next video where I show you how to limit login attempts on your server with fail to ban.